All that it did was show me who I was more clearly because of the constraints I set around myself. Like, it's a really interesting experiment, and I'm so glad that I did it. And I'm so glad that I failed. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to reflect upon a challenge I set myself at the beginning of 2021, which was to go on a no-buy year. If you've never heard of this concept, a no-buy year is essentially what it sounds like. You try not to buy things. Basically, that's it. Try not to spend your money for an entire year, except for on essential items. And at the beginning of 2021, I listed out what I thought were my essential items and what I thought were inessential items. And I even allowed myself a few luxuries, things like, buying things for my house plants, pastries, things that are I would consider luxuries. So some people might say that I actually went on a low buy year rather than a no buy year. I don't really focus too much on the details. And if you were interested in like what my exact rules were, you can go back and watch that video. But ultimately, the biggest thing that I had a problem that I felt like I'm so sorry. Bob is crazy every time I come in the office to film. She's just insane. What was I saying? Yeah, as I was doing my end of year finances last year, I realized how much money I'd spent on books. It was ridiculous how many books I had accumulated over the course of a single year. And obviously, a lot of people would say that I read a lot. I read around 40 books a year, but I was accumulating many, many more books than 40 a year. And so it wasn't even like a balance, one in, one out, something like that. It was literally just consumption. And it was as if I was so indoctrinated into a capitalist mindset that I felt that owning books was the same thing as reading books. And so that was the thing I was really trying to combat in my no buy year. I was really successful at not buying any books for around 5.5 months. I think the first book that I bought was halfway through May. And even that was kind of a gift, but it was a gift that I coerced my ex into buying me. Coerced lovingly, obviously. It was a gift and all of that. But then after that, the floodgates just opened. I realized how many books that I'd wanted to read that had just come out or that were just being published. And I felt that I also wanted to support the bookshops that were struggling throughout lockdown. And I didn't want those spaces to be shut down for any reason. And I just felt like books and the publishing industry were things that I cared so much about that I just didn't want to just cut that off purely for the sake of going on a no buy year. But at the same time, I felt that the challenge was really challenging in unique ways. And my failures throughout the year really showed me things about myself and about my habits as a consumer and about my ideas about myself and my values, and the things that I would spend my money on would always illuminate something really interesting that I hadn't noticed before I attempted this challenge. So ultimately, yes, I failed my no-buy year. Around the 6-7 month mark of the year, I had completely given up on the ideal of not spending my money on books anymore, as well as on many of the other rules I set myself. Unlike a lot of people who do this challenge, my problem was never fashion. I rarely spend my money on clothes, and if I do, it's often secondhand. And actually, this year has been really good for me to redirect some of the money that I would usually spend on books and use them on things that are essential items that I have always deemed inessential, things like, clothes. So yeah, anyway, that's all one big ramble to say I've learned a lot. I don't regret doing a no buy year, and I don't feel bad about failing it. In fact, I feel like I learned more from failing it than I would have if I had perfectly succeeded at it. Like, I don't even know, it wouldn't have been a challenge if I had. So I just wanted to talk through a couple of the insights that I gained through the process. And I only really have 10 minutes, so let's try to do this quickly. One of the biggest things I learned was that it's easier to avoid going to places where you're going to be tempted than to go to those places and not spend your money. So obviously at the beginning of 2021, there was a lockdown. We were still in lockdown. And then as lockdown eased and as I was allowed to go out more frequently and to be in commercial spaces, things like bookshops, cafes, etc., I found it harder to resist spending my money. That being said, I also really learned that it's really hard to find places in the world beyond like nature, parks, things like that, where you're not expected to spend money in order to gain access to them. Like even places on campus, I feel like the only reason that now that I'm back on campus, I feel entitled to like sit in a cafe and not buy a drink or not buy a pastry is because I've already paid to be on campus. And so the existence of non-commercial spaces is like really diminished, I think, in our capitalist society, and it's really upsetting. But yeah, that's a huge insight. I think if you're gonna go into a no-buy year, just avoid the places that you're tempted entirely instead of going. Like when the bookshops reopened, I went to the bookshops and I walked around and I was so drawn to so many of the books, and that I had to like pull myself away and not spend my money and not buy any of the books. And I would watch YouTube videos of people recommending books, and I would create lists of books that I was really interested in reading for the future. But ultimately, and I'll talk more about this in my final year kind of wrap up and favorite books video. But a lot of the books that I ended up reading this year were new releases, were books I was hearing about, were books that I saw in the bookshops. And I think that I have a misconception about my reading. I think that I read more like classic literature, but I actually read a lot of contemporary literature, and that's where my interests are. So my idea of myself as a consumer and the reality were two completely different things. And every time that I made a mistake according to my rules, every time I broke a rule that I'd set myself, I realized, well, I reflected on it, and then I realized something about myself as a consumer. So it was like a really interesting challenge to take up for that reason. Anyways, other things that I learned, let's see. Oh, I learned that it's really easy to get swept away by purchases. It was much harder to actually go through the process of shopping and only buy the thing that I went out to shop for. And especially this is true of like, again, the physical spaces. It was really hard to buy a single thing. It was much easier to buy nothing at all. And it was very tempting to buy lots of things that I didn't intend to buy when I was going out to buy a single thing. So in my ideal world, I would be someone who has enough self-control and intentionality to go out and only buy the thing that I went out to buy. And that I think in the future, although I'm not going to be attempting like a full super extreme no buy year anytime soon, I think it will be really helpful to keep reflecting upon, did I go out with the intention of buying anything? If not, why did I buy something? And did I buy more than one thing? And is that like a sustainable way to move through the world and use my capital, essentially? A huge thing that I learned and I keep learning and I keep forgetting, and this was something that in general with my 2021 goals, I think I just completely forgotten this massive insight, which is that regardless of how big or small my goals are, it does not matter. It has no bearing on whether or not I'm going to actually be able to accomplish them. It's not about goals, it's about systems. And ultimately, I didn't create enough systems. I didn't create systems of accountability. I didn't really, think ahead enough of like what I was doing. Like going on the no buy year was quite an impulsive, like last minute decision, because after the crazy consumer month of December, a gift giving time for me and my family, I just felt so sick of all of that consumption ideology, mindset, all of that stuff. Not that I don't like gift giving. I absolutely love gift giving, but I think the month of December really pushed me over the edge, and I realized like, okay, I just need to go on a no buy year. And that's, my counteraction, like the swing of the pendulum went to the other extreme when I was setting my goals. But again, I did not set systems in place to ensure that I would succeed. And again, like I said, failure was really helpful for me to reflect upon things and to understand myself better. But yeah, it is what it is. And that's the insight I keep learning, and that hopefully one day I will just focus on systems and not on goals. I also learned that my spending is emotional. I think I used to think, oh, I'm not an emotional spender because I don't, shop when I'm feeling sad, especially for things that are traditionally what people associate with emotional spending. So again, fashion items, food, like those are not the things that I spend my money on when I'm feeling down. But I actually do spend emotionally. I think it's really, again, hard to dissociate emotions from finances. We live in such a classist society. We live in such a capitalist world. And our worth is very often associated with what we have in our bank account. And our worth is very often associated with how we perform as consumers in different scenarios. Consumers and producers, that actually. And so I realize I do spend my money when I'm stressed. I do spend my money when I'm upset, when I'm having a really bad day. The thing that I go to for comfort is a bookstore. And again, it was one of the reasons, like mental health was one of the reasons that I moved away from the extremity of a no-buy year, like halfway through the year, because I realized bookshops are such a huge part of what makes me feel comfortable, what makes me feel like connected to culture, connected to a part of myself that I wasn't connected to even throughout a whole year of my master's program, because it was all online. And so I didn't want to put a distance between me and the thing that brought me comfort. But at the same time, I didn't always have to spend my money in order to access those spaces. It was just built into the sort of dynamics of what it means to go into a shop. And I think practicing going somewhere and not spending my money, or leaving my wallet at home, was a huge and really interesting experiment. And it was like, why don't we do that more often? Just leave your wallet at home and then you can't spend your money, So yeah, anyway, I learned that my spending is emotional. I just spend on things that often I wouldn't associate with emotional spending. And finally, I think the last thing I learned was that I'm not going to change as a person by doing a no-buy year. I'm not going to become an ideal version of myself by doing this. It's just going to show me, doing any challenge for that matter, but all that it did was show me who I was more clearly because of the constraints I set around myself. So I would recommend it to just challenge the consumer mindset and the capitalist system that we live in, just to see what it is that you do actually spend money on. What do you do in moments of stress? What are your instincts? When do you reach for your card? When do you reach for your cash? It's a really interesting experiment, and I'm so glad that I did it. And I'm so glad that I failed, because I have a much healthier relationship to myself as a consumer, the world around me, and a much more critical perspective that I can now look at, the beginning of 2021 versus the end of 2021. How many books did I actually buy this year? Was it less than last year? What kind of books did I buy? What kind of books did I think I was going to read? And then what kind of books did I actually read? More on that in my end of year wrap up, which I'm super excited to film, but obviously it's still early days. I still have many books that I could probably read before then. But yeah, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're doing a no-buy year, I hope you've learned as much as I have. And if you're considering it, I hope this video helps. And I will speak to you guys very soon. Bye!